There are cases that refuse to sleep, cases that linger in the filing cabinets of small-town sheriff's offices, gathering dust but never quite fading from memory. Cases where the evidence whispers instead of shouts, where the answers hide just beyond the edge of what we can prove. The disappearance of Rebecca Lynn Hartwell was one of those cases. For 38 years, her name lived in the margins of Texas law enforcement, a question mark etched into the dry landscape of West Texas, a mystery that haunted everyone who touched it. And then, in the spring of 2024, a single strand of DNA changed everything. But to understand how it ended, you have to go back to where it began. Back to October 1986, to a stretch of highway where the mesquite grows thick and the night comes down like a curtain. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell taught third grade at Lincoln Elementary in San Angelo. She was 28 years old, unmarried, living alone in a small rental house on Irving Street. Her life was modest and orderly. Lesson plans on Sunday nights, grocery shopping on Thursdays, church every other week. She wasn't the type to take risks or invite trouble. Her friends described her as dependable, almost predictable. The kind of woman who kept emergency candles in the kitchen drawer and always locked her doors. On the evening of October 17, 1986, Rebecca left school around 4:30 in the afternoon. She'd stayed late to grade spelling tests and organize supplies for an upcoming field trip. The janitor, Mr. Orozco, remembered seeing her walk to her car with a canvas tote bag over her shoulder, her keys already in hand. She waved goodbye. He waved back. It was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Lynn Hartwell alive. What happened next has been pieced together through fragments, witness statements that contradict each other, physical evidence that raises more questions than answers, and a timeline that never quite made sense. Around 6:15 that evening, a gas station attendant named Darrell Hutchins claimed he saw a white Honda Accord, matching Rebecca's description, pull into the Lonesome Star Motel, about 12 miles south of San Angelo on Highway 67. He remembered it because the motel had a reputation. It wasn't the kind of place teachers usually stayed. The Lonesome Star was a relic even then. 8 rooms in a single-story L-shaped building, painted a faded turquoise that peeled in long strips. The neon sign out front flickered the word vacancy in pink letters that buzzed like dying insects. The motel sat alone on a stretch of highway where the land opened up into scrubland and limestone outcrops, where the nearest neighbor was a shuttered feed store half a mile down the road. It was the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be found, or when they had no other choice. The motel clerk that night was a man named Eugene Farris, 62 years old, a retired oil field worker with a drinker's complexion and a habit of minding his own business. He told investigators that a woman matching Rebecca's description had checked into room 7 around 6:30. She paid cash for one night. She didn't ask for a receipt. Eugene said she seemed distracted, kept looking back toward the parking lot like she was expecting someone. He asked if she needed help with luggage. She said no. She took the key and walked toward the room, and that was the last time Eugene Farris saw her. At approximately 8:45 that same evening, a trucker named Leonard Hayes pulled into the Lonesome Star parking lot to use the payphone near the office. He was parked there for maybe 10 minutes making a call to his dispatcher when he noticed something strange. Room 7's door was open, not wide open, just cracked a few inches, and the light inside was off. The white Honda was still parked directly in front of the room, driver's side door ajar, interior light on. Leonard didn't think much of it at the time. People forget to close doors. Cars don't always latch right. But later, when the police came asking, that detail would matter. By midnight, Eugene Farris was making his rounds, checking to see which rooms needed fresh towels in the morning. When he passed room 7, he noticed the door was still open. The car was still there, engine cold, keys in the ignition. That's when he looked closer. That's when he saw the boot. It was lying on its side in the gravel, about 3 feet from the car's open door, a brown leather boot with a stacked heel and a worn sole, the kind of practical footwear a schoolteacher might wear on a Friday. Just one boot, the right one. Eugene bent down, picked it up, turned it over in his hands. He called out. No answer. He pushed the motel room door open wider and reached inside to flip the light switch. The room was empty. The bed was still made. There was no luggage, no purse, no sign anyone had ever been inside, except for a faint smell that Eugene couldn't quite place, something organic and damp, like wet earth or the musk of an animal. And on the door itself, just above the handle where Eugene's hand had been moments before, were 3 deep scratches carved into the wood. Parallel lines evenly spaced, running vertically down the painted surface. They looked fresh. The wood beneath was pale and splintered. Eugene Farris called the Tom Green County Sheriff's Office at 12:17 a.m. on October 18th. Deputy Clayton Moore arrived 20 minutes later with a flashlight and a notepad, expecting a domestic dispute or maybe a drunk who'd wandered off into the scrub. What he found instead was a scene that didn't fit any narrative he knew. Rebecca's car was unlocked, keys still in the ignition, purse sitting on the passenger seat with her wallet, driver's license, and $32 in cash still inside. Her canvas tote bag was in the back seat, filled with graded spelling tests and a paperback copy of Lonesome Dove. There was no sign of a struggle inside the vehicle, no blood, no torn fabric, no broken glass, just the open door and the missing boot. Deputy Moore walked the perimeter of the motel with his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the gravel and the surrounding brush. The ground was dry and hard-packed, not ideal for preserving footprints, but near the edge of the parking lot where the gravel gave way to dirt, he found something. A print, or part of one. It was larger than a human footprint, maybe 13-14 inches long, and the shape was wrong, too wide at the front. The impression was deep, as if whatever made it was heavy. Moore crouched down, traced the outline with his finger. He'd grown up hunting in West Texas. He knew deer tracks, coyote tracks, javelina, even the occasional mountain lion. This didn't match any of them. He called for backup. By dawn, the Lonesome Star Motel was swarming with deputies, investigators, and a K-9 unit borrowed from the San Angelo Police Department. The dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, picked up a scent trail leading from room 7 toward the open land beyond the motel's property line. The trail led south into the mesquite and limestone hills, winding through thick brush and dry creek beds. Ranger followed the scent for nearly a quarter mile before stopping abruptly near a cluster of juniper trees. The dog circled, whined, and sat down. The handler tried to coax him forward. Ranger refused. Whatever scent he'd been following ended there, in a clearing surrounded by rock and thorny shrubs, where the only sound was the wind moving through the branches. Investigators combed the area for hours. They found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no signs of a campsite or a grave. Just the scrubland and the silence. But on the trunk of one of the juniper trees, about 8 feet off the ground, there were marks, scratches. 4 of them this time, raked diagonally across the bark, deep enough to expose the pale wood underneath. The spacing was similar to the marks on the motel room door. Captain Raymond Delgado, the lead investigator from the Tom Green County Sheriff's Office, stood in that clearing and tried to make sense of it. He was a methodical man, a veteran of 20 years in law enforcement, and he didn't believe in jumping to conclusions. He ordered his team to photograph everything, bag samples of the torn bark, and canvass every inch of ground within a 2-mile radius. They interviewed Eugene Farris 3 times. They tracked down Leonard Hayes, the trucker, and took his statement. They spoke to Rebecca's family, her co-workers, her neighbors. They pulled her phone records and bank statements. They checked for signs of a boyfriend, a stalker, a debt, a threat. There was nothing. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell had simply vanished. In the days that followed, local newspapers picked up the story. Teacher missing after motel stop. Search continues for San Angelo woman. Rebecca's face appeared on flyers, stapled to telephone poles and taped to gas station windows. Tips poured into the sheriff's office, dozens of them, most leading nowhere. Someone claimed they'd seen a woman matching Rebecca's description hitchhiking near Abilene. Another caller insisted she'd run off with a married man. A psychic from Houston sent a letter describing visions of water and darkness. None of it checked out. But there were other calls, quieter ones, calls that didn't make it into the official reports, at least not right away. A rancher named Bill Kern, whose property bordered the area where Ranger had lost the scent, told deputies he'd heard something strange the night Rebecca disappeared. He'd been out checking his fence line around 9:30, maybe 10 o'clock, when he heard a sound coming from the hills. He described it as a low, guttural noise, not quite a growl, not quite a cry. It lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. Bill said his cattle had been spooked for days afterward, bunching together in the far corner of the pasture, refusing to graze near the tree line. A woman named Carla Simmons, who lived in a trailer about a mile east of the Lonesome Star, reported that her dog had gone missing around the same time. A healthy Labrador, 4 years old, that never strayed far from home. She'd found him 2 days later, hiding under her porch, trembling and refusing to eat. When she finally coaxed him out, there were scratches along his side, shallow but unmistakable, 3 parallel lines. These accounts were noted, filed, and largely dismissed. West Texas was full of coyotes, bobcats, and the occasional stray dog. Cattle spooked easily. Coincidences happened. Captain Delgado focused on the evidence he could measure: the boot, the car, the scratches, the footprint. He sent the boot to the state crime lab in Austin for analysis. He had the scratches on the door and the tree photographed and compared. He even consulted with a wildlife biologist from Angelo State University, a man named Dr. Patrick Odoms, who specialized in predator behavior. Dr. Odoms examined the photographs of the scratches and the partial footprint. He was careful with his words. He said the scratches could have been made by a large animal, a mountain lion possibly, though the spacing was unusually wide. The footprint was harder to explain. It didn't match any native species he was familiar with. It could have been distorted by the soil conditions, he suggested, or it might have been a composite print, 2 animals stepping in the same spot, overlapping, or it could have been something else entirely. He didn't speculate further. The investigation dragged on through November and into December. The physical evidence was processed, catalogued, and stored. The DNA technology of 1986 was primitive compared to what we have today. They could type blood, identify some basic genetic markers, but the kind of detailed profiling that would later revolutionize criminal justice was still years away. Samples were taken from the car, from the motel room, from the scratches on the door. Most of it came back inconclusive or contaminated. There was no blood, no semen, no clear biological evidence pointing to a suspect. Rebecca's family held a vigil in December. Her mother, a retired nurse named Judith Hartwell, stood in front of the cameras and begged for information. She held up a photograph of Rebecca, smiling, wearing a yellow sundress, standing in front of a Christmas tree. "She's still out there," Judith said, her voice breaking. "Someone knows something. Please, bring my daughter home." But no one did. The case went cold. Over the years, new leads would surface from time to time. In 1991, a hiker found a deteriorated boot near a creek bed 30 miles north of San Angelo. It was sent to the lab, tested, and ruled out. Wrong size, wrong brand. In 1998, a prisoner in Huntsville claimed he had information about Rebecca's disappearance, hoping for a reduced sentence. He was interviewed, polygraphed, and dismissed. In 2003, the case was briefly reopened when a different cold case in the region showed similar patterns. A missing woman, an abandoned car, strange marks, but the connection fell apart under scrutiny. Captain Raymond Delgado retired in 2005. Before he left, he boxed up the case files himself, every photograph and statement and scrap of evidence, and handed them to his successor with a single piece of advice: don't stop looking. He died in 2017, never knowing what really happened to Rebecca Lynn Hartwell. But evidence doesn't disappear. It waits. And in the spring of 2024, 38 years after Rebecca vanished, a forensic genealogist named Dr. Angela Reyes opened those boxes and found something everyone else had missed: a single hair follicle preserved on a piece of clear tape lifted from the passenger seat of Rebecca's Honda. It had been catalogued in 1986, tested with the limited technology available at the time, and filed away as unknown male contributor. The sample had been sitting in a climate-controlled evidence locker in Austin for nearly 4 decades. Dr. Reyes extracted the DNA and ran it through the modern databases, and this time she got a hit. Was that evidence always there, waiting in the dark? Or was it something we weren't meant to find? The hit came back to a man named Douglas Wayne Pritchard, 67 years old, living in a VA nursing facility outside of Lubbock, Texas. The DNA match wasn't direct. Pritchard himself wasn't in any criminal database, but his genetic profile showed up through a third-party genealogy site, one of those services where people send in saliva samples, hoping to find long-lost cousins or trace their ancestry back to Ireland or West Africa. Someone in Pritchard's extended family had uploaded their DNA years ago, searching for relatives, and that thread led Dr. Reyes straight to him. Douglas Pritchard wasn't a ghost. He had a paper trail, military service records, a dishonorable discharge from the Army in 1982, a string of misdemeanor arrests for public intoxication and trespassing throughout the 80s and 90s. He'd worked as a roughneck in the Permian Basin oil fields, as a handyman, as a night security guard at a warehouse in Odessa. He'd never been convicted of a violent crime, never been on anyone's radar for something like this. But in October of 1986, Douglas Pritchard had been living in San Angelo, Texas, less than 3 miles from the Lonesome Star Motel. Tom Green County Sheriff's Office assigned the case to Detective Maria Castillo, a sharp, no-nonsense investigator who'd spent the last 15 years working cold cases. Maria was the kind of cop who didn't believe in luck. She believed in patience and patterns. When Dr. Reyes called her with the DNA results, Maria pulled Pritchard's file and started building a timeline. On October 17, 1986, Douglas Pritchard had been 30 years old, unemployed, and living in a rented trailer on the outskirts of San Angelo. According to utility records, his electricity had been shut off 2 weeks prior for non-payment. Neighbors from that time, the few Maria could track down, remembered him as a loner, someone who kept odd hours, didn't speak much, sometimes disappeared into the countryside for days at a time. One neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Glenda Morrison, recalled seeing Pritchard drive past her house the evening of October 17th in an old brown pickup truck, headed south on the county road that connected to Highway 67. She remembered it because his headlight was out, just one beam cutting through the dusk, and she'd thought he'd get pulled over. Maria drove out to Lubbock on a grey morning in April 2024 to interview Douglas Pritchard in person. The nursing home was a low beige building surrounded by flat plains and cotton fields, the kind of place where people went to wait. Pritchard was in a wheelchair now, his body ravaged by emphysema and decades of hard living. His hair was thin and white, his hands spotted with liver marks, his eyes a pale, washed-out blue. When Maria walked into the common room and introduced herself, Pritchard didn't flinch. He just nodded, like he'd been expecting this conversation for 38 years. They sat in a small visiting room with fluorescent lights and a poster of a beach scene taped to the wall. Maria placed a digital recorder on the table between them and read Pritchard his rights. He waved them off. "I know my rights," he said, his voice rough as gravel. "Ask your questions." Maria started gently. She asked about his time in San Angelo, about his work history, about what he remembered from 1986. Pritchard's answers were vague, non-committal. He said he didn't remember much from back then. He'd been drinking heavily in those days. Lost time, lost years. Maria nodded, let him talk, waited for the right moment. Then she slid a photograph across the table, Rebecca Lynn Hartwell, smiling in her yellow sundress. "Do you know this woman?" Pritchard stared at the photo for a long time. His jaw worked like he was chewing on something. Finally, he shook his head. "Never seen her." "Your DNA was found in her car." Pritchard's eyes flicked up to meet Maria's. For a moment, something passed across his face. Recognition, maybe, or fear. Then it was gone. "That's impossible," he said. "I've never been in anyone's car but my own." Maria leaned back in her chair. "You were living 3 miles from the Lonesome Star Motel in October 1986. You were seen driving south on Highway 67 the same night Rebecca Hartwell disappeared. And your DNA, your genetic material, was recovered from the passenger seat of her vehicle. So I'll ask you again. Do you know this woman?" Pritchard's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. His breathing was labored, the oxygen tube in his nose hissing softly. "I want a lawyer," he said. The interview ended there. Maria returned to San Angelo and began digging deeper. She obtained a warrant for Pritchard's medical records. his VA files, anything that might shed light on where he'd been and what he'd done in the fall of 1986. What she found painted a troubling picture. In November of 1986, just 3 weeks after Rebecca disappeared, Douglas Pritchard had checked himself into a VA hospital in Amarillo, Texas, claiming he was having severe psychological episodes, nightmares, flashbacks, paranoia. He stayed there for 6 days, was prescribed antipsychotic medication, and discharged with a referral for outpatient therapy that he never followed up on. The intake notes described him as agitated and disoriented, mentioning that he'd sustained several deep scratches on his left forearm and shoulder, which he claimed came from an animal in the brush. The attending physician had noted that the wounds were consistent with a large dog or coyote attack, though Pritchard refused to elaborate. Maria cross-referenced those dates with the timeline. The scratches on Pritchard's body appeared sometime in the week following Rebecca's disappearance. And there was something else, a small notation in the VA file that caught Maria's attention. During his stay at the hospital, Pritchard had been observed sleepwalking on 2 separate occasions, found wandering the hallways in the middle of the night, muttering incoherently. The night staff had documented his words. Too big. Shouldn't have been there. Not supposed to be real. Maria sat at her desk and stared at that line for a long time. It could mean anything. Trauma, guilt, psychosis, or just the ramblings of a disturbed man. But it nagged at her. She returned to the original case file and reread every witness statement, every scrap of evidence. She pulled the photographs of the scratches on the motel room door, the marks on the juniper tree, the partial footprint in the dirt. She contacted Dr. Patrick Odoms, the wildlife biologist who'd consulted on the case in 1986. He was retired now, living in Fredericksburg, but he still remembered the Hartwell case. He agreed to meet with Maria. They sat in Dr. Odom's backyard under a live oak tree, drinking iced tea while he paged through the old photographs Maria had brought. He studied them with the same careful attention he'd given them nearly 40 years ago. "I told them back then," he said, "these marks don't fit any animal I know. The spacing is wrong, the depth is inconsistent. If I had to guess, and this is just a guess, I'd say they were made by something with unusual strength and a grip pattern we don't typically see in Texas wildlife." "What about a human?" Maria asked. "Could a person have made these marks?" Dr. Odoms considered this. With a tool, maybe. A rake or some kind of claw-shaped implement. But the depth of the gouges suggests significant force. And the angle. These were made from above, coming downward. Either someone very tall or... He trailed off. Or what? Or something that wasn't standing on the ground when it made them. Maria felt a chill despite the warm afternoon. "You're saying it could have been climbing?" "I'm saying I don't know." Dr. Odom set the photographs down. "There are accounts, throughout history, of animals people can't quite explain. Black panthers in areas where they shouldn't exist. Wolves bigger than any recorded specimen. Creatures seen at a distance in low light that don't fit the catalogue. Most of the time it's misidentification, a known animal seen under unusual circumstances. But every once in a while," he shrugged, "every once in a while you get something that doesn't add up." Maria thanked him and drove back to San Angelo, her mind turning over the possibilities. She knew what the evidence showed. Douglas Pritchard's DNA in Rebecca's car. Scratches on his body appearing around the same time. A psychological breakdown shortly afterward. It was enough to build a case, but it wasn't the whole story. There were still the marks on the door and the tree, the footprint that didn't match any known species, the smell Eugene Ferris had described, the way Ranger the K9 had refused to continue tracking. She decided to go back to the beginning, back to the Lonesome Star Motel. The motel was still standing, barely. It had closed down in the late 90s, the building abandoned and left to the elements. The turquoise paint had faded to grey, the windows were boarded up, and the parking lot was cracked and overgrown with weeds. The old neon sign lay in pieces near the road, pink glass scattered like broken teeth. Maria parked her truck and walked the perimeter, trying to imagine the scene as it had been in 1986. Room 7 was at the far end of the building, its door still marked with a faded number. Maria approached slowly, her boots crunching on broken glass. The door was locked, but the wood was rotted through. She pushed gently, and it swung inward with a groan. The room was gutted. No bed, no furniture, just bare walls streaked with water damage and graffiti. The floor was littered with trash and animal droppings. Maria stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the dim interior. She walked to the spot where the door had once had those 3 scratches, ran her hand over the wood. The marks were still there, faint but visible, worn smooth by time. She stood there for a moment, listening. The wind moved through the empty building, whistling softly through gaps in the roof. From somewhere outside she heard a bird call, sharp and sudden, then silence. Maria pulled out her phone and called Dr. Reyes. "I need you to retest the samples from the door scratches," she said. "Not just the wood. I want any organic material that might have been preserved. Skin cells, hair, anything." Dr. Reyes hesitated. "Maria, those samples are almost 40 years old. The chances of recovering usable DNA are—" "I know the chances," Maria interrupted. "Do it anyway." 3 weeks later, the results came back. There were 2 DNA contributors on the door scratches. One was Douglas Wayne Pritchard. The other was unknown, not in any database, not matching any human profile on record. Dr. Reyes ran the sample through multiple tests, compared it against every species in the genetic library. The closest match was canine, but the markers were off. The sequence showed anomalies, irregularities that didn't fit the expected pattern. Dr. Reyes called it degraded and inconclusive, but she couldn't explain what it was. Maria arranged a second interview with Douglas Pritchard. This time, she brought the DNA results, the photographs, and a recording of Eugene Farris's original statement describing the smell and the scratches. She laid it all out on the table in front of him. "I know you were there," Maria said. "Your DNA proves it. But I also know you weren't alone. Something else was there that night. Something that left marks we can't explain. I need you to tell me what happened." Pritchard stared at the evidence for a long time. His breathing was ragged, his hands trembling. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You won't believe me. Try me." He closed his eyes. "I was driving that night. Just driving around. Nowhere to go. I saw her car at the motel. Saw her go into the room. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe I was going to ask for money. Maybe I was just... I don't know. I parked down the road and walked back. I was going to knock on her door. But then I heard something. A sound. Like breathing. Heavy. Close." Maria leaned forward. "What did you see?" Pritchard opened his eyes and they were wet. "I didn't see anything at first. It was dark. But I felt it. Something was there behind the building in the shadows. And it was big. Bigger than any man. I heard it move. Branches breaking, gravel shifting. And then I saw the shape. Just for a second. It was tall, hunched over, moving on all fours. But not like a dog. Not like anything I'd ever seen." "What did you do?" "I ran," Pritchard said. "I ran to my truck and got the hell out of there. But I couldn't stop thinking about her. About that woman alone in the room. So I turned around. I went back. And when I got there, the door was open. Her car was open. The boot was on the ground. And she was gone." Maria's pulse quickened. "Did you go inside the room?" "I touched the door," Pritchard said. "I pushed it open, looked inside. There was nothing, just that smell, like wet fur and iron. And then I heard it again, that breathing coming from the hills. I panicked. I got in my truck and drove. I didn't stop until I was 50 miles away." "Why didn't you report it?" Pritchard laughed bitterly. "Report what? That I saw a monster? That something out of a nightmare took a woman and I did nothing to stop it? I was a drunk with a record. Who would have believed me?" Maria sat back. "Do you believe it?" Pritchard met her eyes. "I don't know what I believe anymore. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just a bear or a big dog and my mind made it into something worse. But I've lived with it for 38 years, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that whatever I saw that night, it wasn't supposed to exist. Could a man's guilt shape his memory into something darker than the truth? Or was he the only one willing to say what others refused to see? Maria left the nursing home with more questions than answers. She compiled her findings into a report and presented it to the district attorney's office. The DNA evidence was strong enough to charge Douglas Pritchard with involvement in Rebecca Hartwell's disappearance, but the case was complicated. Pritchard's story, as bizarre as it sounded, was consistent, and there was still the unknown DNA, the marks, the footprint, all the pieces that didn't fit a simple narrative. The DA decided to hold off on charges pending further investigation. Maria was told to keep digging. So she did. She tracked down Bill Kern, the rancher who'd heard the strange sound the night Rebecca disappeared. He was in his 80s now, still living on the same land, still working his cattle with hands that never stopped moving. He invited Maria to sit on his porch and they talked for over an hour. Bill remembered that night vividly. He'd been checking fences when he heard the noise, low, guttural, something that made his skin crawl. His cattle had bunched together in fear, and they'd stayed spooked for days. But there was something else he hadn't told the deputies back in 1986, something he'd kept to himself because he didn't think anyone would believe him. 2 days after Rebecca disappeared, Bill had found tracks on his property. Not just one or two, but a trail of them, leading from the hills down toward his pasture and then disappearing into the creek bed. The prints were large, misshapen, pressed deep into the soil. Bill had taken a photograph with an old Polaroid camera. He went inside and came back with a shoebox full of faded photos. He sifted through them until he found the one he was looking for and handed it to Maria. The photograph showed a single footprint in the dirt, illuminated by harsh sunlight. It was at least 14 inches long, broad at the front, with what looked like claw marks extending from the toes. The edges were blurred, the details unclear, but the shape was unmistakable. It was the same print Deputy Moore had found in 1986. "I kept this all these years," Bill said. "Never showed it to anyone. Didn't want people thinking I was crazy. But I know what I saw, and I know that whatever made those tracks wasn't natural." Maria thanked him and took the photograph. She added it to the growing file, the ever-expanding collection of evidence that refused to form a coherent picture. DNA from a man who claimed he'd witnessed something impossible. Marks that didn't match any known animal. Testimonies from people who'd heard and seen things they couldn't explain. And in the center of it all, a woman who'd vanished without a trace. The case was no longer just about solving a disappearance. It was about deciding what kind of truth to accept. Detective Maria Castillo spent the next month doing something she'd never done in her 15 years of law enforcement. She studied cryptozoology. Not because she believed in monsters, but because she needed to understand the landscape of fear and misidentification. She read reports of alleged Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, chupacabra encounters in South Texas, Black Panther sightings in Appalachia. She learned how the human mind processes terror, how shadows become shapes, how the unknown fills itself in with the only narratives we have available. Most of it was nonsense. Blurry photographs, exaggerated stories, people desperate for attention or meaning. But buried in the noise were patterns, genuine encounters with something unusual, witnesses who had nothing to gain from their testimony, physical evidence that couldn't be easily dismissed. Maria didn't know what to make of it. She only knew that Rebecca Hartwell deserved better than to be filed away as an unsolved mystery. And if that meant following the evidence wherever it led, no matter how strange, then that's what she'd do. She returned to the original case file and found something she'd overlooked before. In the days following Rebecca's disappearance, a state park ranger named Vincent Torres had filed a report with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department about unusual activity in the South Llano River State Park, about 40 miles southwest of the Lonesome Star Motel. Torres had been patrolling a remote section of the park in late October 1986 when he discovered a campsite that had been violently disturbed. The tent was shredded, the cooler torn open, food scattered across the ground. At first he'd assumed it was a bear, but there were no bears in that part of Texas. The damage pattern was wrong, too methodical, too aggressive. Torres had photographed the scene and filed his report, noting that the campers, a young couple from Austin, had fled the area in the middle of the night and never returned to collect their belongings. The couple had given a statement to park officials, claiming they'd heard something circling their tent around 2 a.m. Something large that moved with purpose. They described a rancid smell, and a low rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in the chest of whatever was out there. When they'd finally worked up the courage to unzip the tent and shine a flashlight into the darkness, they saw nothing. But in the morning they found tracks, the same oversized, misshapen prints that had been found near the Lonesome Star. Maria tracked down Vincent Torres. He was retired now, living in a cabin near Fredericksburg, spending his days fishing and woodworking. He was a soft-spoken man in his early 70s, with the kind of calm demeanor that comes from a lifetime spent in the wilderness. When Maria showed him the photographs from Rebecca's case, his expression darkened. "I remember this," he said, tapping the image of the scratches on the juniper tree. "I've seen marks like these before. Not just that one time in '86, but other times too." Over the years, every few years, something would happen in the parks. Campsites torn apart, livestock killed in strange ways, tracks that didn't match anything in the books. Most of us rangers just didn't talk about it. We'd file the reports, clean up the mess and move on. You start telling people you think there's something unusual out there, and pretty soon you're a joke. "Do you think there's something unusual out there?" Maria asked. Torres was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the hills beyond his property. "I think the wilderness is bigger and older than we give it credit for. I think there are places where the rules don't quite apply the way we expect them to, and I think that when people go missing in those places, we owe it to them to ask the hard questions, even if the answers make us uncomfortable." He went inside and returned with a battered field journal, the kind with a weather-resistant cover and gridded pages. He'd kept notes over the years, personal observations that never made it into official reports. He flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, a hand-drawn map of West Texas with small red X's marked in various locations. Each X represented an incident he couldn't explain. A mutilated deer carcass with claw marks too large for any known predator, a rancher's gate torn clean off its hinges, a series of sightings along the same geographic corridor running from San Angelo down to the Edwards Plateau. "There's a pattern," Torres said, tracing his finger along the marks. "Whatever it is, it moves through this region. Always has. The Comanche used to tell stories about it, a spirit that walked the hills, something that took people who wandered too far from the firelight. I always thought they were just stories. But then you see things, you find evidence, and you start to wonder." Maria photographed the journal pages and added them to her file. She was building a case now, not for a courtroom but for herself. She needed to know. She contacted the Austin couple who'd fled the campsite in 1986. It took some effort to track them down. They'd married, moved to Colorado, and rarely spoke about their experience. But when Maria finally reached them by phone and explained why she was calling, they agreed to talk. The woman, whose name was Jennifer Payne, sounded tired just recounting the memory. "We tried to forget about it," Jennifer said. "We told ourselves it was just a bear or a mountain lion that we'd overreacted. But my husband, his name is David, he's never been camping since. Not once in 38 years. And I still have dreams about it. That smell, that sound, it wasn't an animal detective, or if it was something we don't have a name for." "Did you see it?" Maria asked. "Not clearly, just a shape. Tall. It moved past the tent and I could see its outline through the fabric. It was on two legs but hunched, like it was too big for its own body, and then it dropped down to all fours and just loped away into the dark. Fast, too fast." David got on the line. His voice was harder, more skeptical. "Look, I don't know what we saw. Maybe it was a person in a costume. Maybe it was a trick of the light and fear. But I'll tell you this. I grew up hunting in Montana. I've seen grizzlies up close. I've tracked elk through the backcountry. Whatever was outside our tent that night, it didn't move like anything I've ever encountered. And when we packed up and left at dawn, we found tracks, big ones, with claws. We took pictures, but they came out blurry. We showed them to a park ranger, and he just nodded like he'd seen it before. That's what scared us the most. Not that something was out there, but that people knew and weren't saying anything." Maria thanked them and hung up. She sat at her desk, surrounded by files and photographs and maps, and tried to construct a narrative that made sense. Douglas Pritchard had been at the motel. His DNA confirmed it. He'd touched the door, maybe gone inside, maybe even interacted with Rebecca before she disappeared. But his story about seeing something else, something he couldn't explain, was corroborated by too many other accounts to dismiss entirely. Either there was a pattern of shared delusion stretching back decades, or there was something in the West Texas wilderness that people had been encountering and misunderstanding for generations. Maria decided to take one more trip into the field. She contacted a forensic anthropologist from Texas State University, Dr. Ethan Kross, who specialized in taphonomy, the study of how organisms decay and leave traces in the environment. If Rebecca's body was out there, if she'd been killed and left in the wilderness, there might still be evidence after 38 years. Bones, fabric, anything that could withstand time and the elements. Dr. Kross agreed to help. On a cool morning in May 2024, Maria and Dr. Kross, along with 2 cadaver dogs and their handlers, returned to the area where Ranger had lost Rebecca's scent in 1986. The landscape had changed, the mesquite was thicker, the creek beds had shifted, and the juniper grove had grown wild and dense. But the bones of the land were the same. They worked methodically, grid by grid, the dogs moving through the brush with their noses to the ground. For 3 hours, they found nothing. And then, just after noon, one of the dogs alerted near a limestone outcropping about a quarter-mile south of the original search area. The handler called Maria over. The dog was pawing at a narrow crevice between 2 rocks, whining softly. Dr. Kross knelt down and shone a flashlight into the gap. He reached in carefully, his hand disappearing into the darkness, and pulled out a piece of fabric. It was faded and rotting, but the color was still visible, cream, like the blouse Rebecca had been wearing the night she vanished. Maria's heart pounded. They spent the next hour carefully excavating the area, removing rocks and soil, searching for more. They found fragments, a button, a scrap of denim, and finally, wedged deep in the crevice, a single human bone. A femur, bleached white by time and weather. Dr. Kross examined it on site, his expression grim. "This is human," he said. "Female based on the size and structure. I'll need to run tests to confirm identity, but given the location and the clothing, it's very likely Rebecca Hartwell." They continued searching but found no more remains. It was as if the body had been scattered, broken apart and distributed across the landscape. Dr. Kross explained that this could happen naturally, scavengers, erosion, time, or it could be the result of trauma. Without more bones, it was impossible to say. The fabric and the femur were sent to the lab for DNA testing. 2 weeks later, the results confirmed what Maria already knew. The bone belonged to Rebecca Lynn Hartwell. After 38 years, they'd found her, but the discovery raised as many questions as it answered. Dr. Kross completed his analysis and called Maria with his findings. The femur showed signs of severe trauma, deep gouges along the shaft, consistent with tooth marks. But the spacing and depth of the marks didn't match any predator native to Texas. He'd compared them to mountain lion, coyote, even domestic dog attacks. None of them fit. The bite force required to make those marks exceeded anything a typical carnivore could produce. "What about a human?" Maria asked. "Could a person have done this?" "Not without tools," Dr. Kross said. "And even then, the pattern is wrong. These marks were made by something with a very powerful jaw and unusually spaced teeth. If I had to guess, and this is purely speculative, I'd say you're looking at something larger and stronger than any animal currently documented in this region." Maria closed her eyes. She thought about Douglas Pritchard, trembling in his wheelchair, insisting he'd seen something impossible. She thought about Vincent Torres and his journal of unexplained incidents. She thought about Bill Kern's photograph and the campsite torn apart in the middle of the night. And she thought about Rebecca Lynn Hartwell, a quiet schoolteacher who'd stopped at the wrong motel on the wrong night and never made it home. She returned to Lubbock one final time to confront Pritchard with the new evidence. She showed him the photograph of the femur, the analysis of the bite marks, the fabric they'd recovered. His face went pale. "She's really gone," he whispered. "All this time I hoped maybe she'd just run away, started a new life somewhere. But she's really gone." "Tell me the truth," Maria said. "All of it. What happened that night?" Pritchard took a shuddering breath. "I told you. I saw something. I know how it sounds. I know you probably think I'm crazy or lying or trying to cover up something I did. But I swear on whatever's left of my soul I didn't hurt that woman. I was a coward. I should have helped her. I should have stayed, should have done something. But I ran. And whatever was in those hills, it took her. What do you think it was? Pritchard shook his head. I don't know. I've asked myself that question every day for 38 years. Some nights I think it was just a bear and my mind made it into a monster because I couldn't live with my own guilt. Other nights I think, maybe there are things in this world we're not supposed to understand, things that live in the places we've forgotten about, that only come out when the night is dark enough and the land is wild enough. I don't have an answer for you, detective. I just know what I saw, and I know I've never been the same since. Maria left the nursing home and sat in her truck for a long time, watching the sun sink below the flat horizon. She had enough evidence now to close the case. Rebecca's remains had been found. Douglas Pritchard's DNA placed him at the scene, and while his story was bizarre, there was no concrete evidence he'd killed her. The bite marks on the bone suggested an animal attack, and the most rational explanation was that Rebecca had encountered a predator, possibly a mountain lion or a large feral dog, and had been killed in the encounter. Pritchard, drunk and disturbed, had stumbled upon the aftermath and his traumatized mind had invented the rest. That was the story that would go in the official report. That was the story that would satisfy the bureaucrats and the press and Rebecca's family, who just wanted closure after nearly 4 decades of not knowing. But Maria knew it wasn't the whole truth. She knew there were pieces that didn't fit, evidence that pointed to something stranger and more unsettling than a simple animal attack. She knew that there were people throughout West Texas who'd seen things they couldn't explain, who'd found tracks and marks and signs of something that existed in the margins of the known world. She thought about what Vincent Torres had said. The wilderness is bigger and older than we give it credit for. Maybe he was right. Maybe there were places where the rules bent, where the impossible crept in through the cracks. Or maybe, Maria thought, the human need to find patterns and meaning in tragedy was strong enough to turn coincidence into conspiracy, fear into legend. She didn't know, and she suspected she never would. Was it an animal that took Rebecca Hartwell that night, or was it something we've learned to stop looking for because the truth is harder to accept than the mystery? Maria drove back to San Angelo as the stars came out, one by one, over the endless Texas sky. She had a report to write, a case to close, and a family to finally give the answer they'd been waiting for. It wasn't the answer anyone wanted, but it was all she had. And somewhere out in the hills, where the mesquite grows thick and the night comes down heavy, something moved through the darkness, leaving no trace but the stories people told and the questions that would never quite go away. Detective Maria Castillo presented her findings to the Tom Green County District Attorney on a humid afternoon in June 2024. The conference room was stuffy, the air conditioning struggling against the West Texas heat. Maria laid out the evidence methodically, the DNA match to Douglas Pritchard, the discovery of Rebecca's remains, the forensic analysis of the bone-showing trauma consistent with a large predator, the timeline of events from October 17, 1986. She included Pritchard's statement, the witness accounts, the photographs of the tracks and scratches. Everything. The DA, a practical woman named Sharon Vega, who'd prosecuted hundreds of cases over 3 decades, listened without interruption. When Maria finished, Sharon leaned back in her chair and studied the evidence spread across the table. "This is solid work, Detective," Sharon said. "But I need to know, do you believe Pritchard killed her?" Maria had been dreading this question. "The evidence shows he was at the scene. His DNA is in her car, on the motel room door. He admits to being there. But the physical trauma to the remains, it's not consistent with a human attack. And his story, as strange as it is, aligns with multiple other accounts of unusual activity in that area going back decades. So what are you saying?" Maria chose her words carefully. "I'm saying that Douglas Pritchard may have witnessed Rebecca Hartwell's death, but I don't believe he caused it. I think she encountered something in those hills, an animal most likely, and Pritchard, in his compromised state, saw the aftermath and has lived with the guilt of not intervening ever since." Sharon was quiet for a moment. You know we can't prosecute a mountain lion. I know. And we can't write in an official report that an unidentified creature killed a woman and leave it at that. The family deserves a clear answer. The public deserves a resolution. Maria nodded. I understand. I'll write it up as an animal attack. Mountain lion, most probable. Pritchard will be cited as a witness who failed to report the incident, but given his current health and the passage of time, I don't recommend charges. Sharon agreed. The case would be officially closed as a death by animal attack, with contributing factors of isolation and unfortunate timing. It was neat. It was rational. It was the kind of conclusion that allowed everyone to move on. But before Maria could file the final report, she had one more responsibility. She had to tell Rebecca's family. Judith Hartwell was 84 years old now, living in a modest home in San Angelo with her younger sister. She'd never remarried after her husband's death in 1995, never left Texas, never stopped hoping that one day someone would bring her daughter home. When Maria called to arrange a meeting, Judith's voice trembled. You found her, Judith said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Mum, I'd like to come by and talk to you in person if that's all right. Come now, Judith said. I've waited long enough. Maria arrived at the house an hour later, carrying a folder with photographs and documents. Judith met her at the door, a small woman with white hair and Rebecca's same gentle eyes. They sat in the living room, surrounded by decades of family photos. Rebecca as a child, Rebecca graduating college, Rebecca in her classroom with her students. Frozen moments of a life that had been cut short. Maria explained everything. She showed Judith the location where Rebecca's remains had been found, the evidence of trauma, the timeline of that terrible night. She told her about Douglas Pritchard, about his presence at the scene and his statement. She was careful with her words, but she didn't sugarcoat the reality. Judith deserved the truth, even if it hurt. When Maria finished, Judith sat in silence, her hands folded in her lap. Tears ran down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Finally, she spoke. Was she alone when it happened? Maria thought about the question, about all the strange evidence and conflicting testimonies. I don't know, she said honestly. There was someone nearby who could have helped and didn't. And there was something else, something in the wilderness. I can't tell you exactly what happened in those final moments, but I can tell you that we found her, and she's not lost anymore. Judith nodded slowly. 38 years. 38 years of not knowing if she was alive somewhere, if she was suffering, if she was calling out for help and no one could hear her. At least now I know. At least now I can bring her home. Maria arranged for Rebecca's remains to be released to the family. A small funeral was held in July at the First Baptist Church in San Angelo, attended by former students, who were now middle-aged adults themselves, colleagues who'd retired long ago, and a handful of people who'd followed the case over the decades and wanted to pay their respects. Judith placed a photograph of Rebecca on the casket, the same one she'd held up at the vigil in 1986, Rebecca smiling in her yellow dress, forever 28. The local newspaper ran a front-page story. Cold case solved after 38 years. Teacher's remains found. Death ruled animal attack. The article quoted Detective Castillo saying that new DNA technology had led to the breakthrough, that a witness had been identified, and that the evidence pointed to a tragic encounter with wildlife. It was a clean narrative. Most people accepted it and moved on, but not everyone. Vincent Torres called Maria 3 days after the funeral. I saw the news, he said. Animal attack. Is that really what you believe? It's what the evidence supports, Maria replied, keeping her voice neutral. But is it what you believe? Maria was quiet for a long time. I believe Rebecca Hartwell encountered something that night. Whether it was a mountain lion or something we don't have a name for, I don't think I'll ever know for sure. But I believe that the wilderness holds more than we're willing to admit. And I believe that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, just understood. Vincent seemed satisfied with that answer. Before he hung up, he said, You did right by her. That's what matters. Maria filed her final report and moved on to other cases, but the Hartwell case stayed with her. She found herself thinking about it late at night, replaying the evidence in her mind, wondering if she'd missed something or if she'd seen exactly what was there and simply couldn't accept it. 3 months after closing the case, Maria received a package in the mail. No return address, just a Lubbock postmark. Inside was a handwritten letter and a small photograph. The letter was from Douglas Pritchard. His handwriting was shaky, the words difficult to read in places, but the message was clear. Detective Castillo, I don't have much time left. The doctors say maybe a few weeks, maybe less. I wanted to write to you before I go because there's something I need to say, something I couldn't say in person. I've spent 38 years carrying the weight of that night. I told you I saw something, and I did. But I didn't tell you everything. When I ran the first time, when I heard that thing in the darkness and got in my truck to leave, I drove about 5 miles down the road before I stopped. I sat there, shaking, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. And then I heard it again. On the radio. I don't know how to explain this. The radio in my truck was off, I'm sure of it. But I heard a voice, static and broken up, like a CB transmission from far away, and the voice was a woman's voice. She was saying, "Help me, please, it's coming back." I don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I don't know if it was Rebecca or some phantom frequency picking up a signal from miles away. But I turned the truck around. I drove back to that motel as fast as I could, and when I got there, everything was wrong. The door open, the car door open, the boot on the ground, and that smell, God, that smell, like death and wet earth. I went to the door. I touched it, left my DNA there like you found. I looked inside, called out, nothing. And then I heard the breathing again, coming from behind the building. I should have gone around back. I should have looked, but I was terrified, so I ran again. I got in my truck and I left, and I've hated myself every day since. I don't know what took her. Maybe it was an animal like you said. Maybe it was something worse. But I think she called out somehow. I think she reached for help, and I was the only one close enough to hear, and I failed her. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the whole truth, even the parts that don't make sense. And because I want you to know that whatever was out there that night, it wasn't just in my head, it was real. And if you ever go back to those hills, if you ever feel that presence, you'll know what I mean. I hope Rebecca's family has found peace. I hope I find some too, wherever I'm going next. Douglas Pritchard. Attached to the letter was a Polaroid photograph, faded and creased. It showed the dashboard of a truck, the radio clearly visible. And on the radio's display, where the station frequency should have been, there were words, scratched into the plastic, or maybe burned there. Maria couldn't tell from the photo. The words were barely legible, but she could make them out. Not alone. Maria stared at the photograph for a long time. She checked the date on the postmark. The letter had been sent 2 weeks earlier. She called the VA nursing facility in Lubbock. Douglas Wayne Pritchard had died 4 days ago, quietly in his sleep. The staff said he'd seemed at peace near the end, that he'd stopped having nightmares. Maria filed the letter with the rest of the case documents, marked it as supplementary evidence, and locked it away. She never showed it to anyone. Some truths, she decided, were too fragile to expose to scrutiny. Some stories needed to remain in the shadows where they belonged. But one evening in late September, as autumn settled over West Texas and the air turned cool, Maria drove out to the Edwards Plateau. She parked near the old Lonesome Star Motel, still abandoned, still crumbling, and walked into the hills as the sun set. She followed the same path Ranger the K9 had taken 38 years earlier, through the mesquite and juniper, past the limestone outcrops, to the clearing where they'd found Rebecca's remains. She stood there as darkness fell, listening to the wind move through the trees, watching the stars emerge one by one. She waited for something, a sound, a presence, a sign that the stories were true. But there was nothing. Just the wilderness, vast and indifferent, keeping its secrets. As she turned to leave, her flashlight beam swept across the trunk of a nearby juniper tree. And there, about 8 feet off the ground, were fresh marks. 4 parallel scratches, deep and deliberate, cutting through the bark to expose the pale wood beneath. They hadn't been there the last time she'd visited. She was sure of it. Maria stood very still. She listened to the night, to the small sounds of creatures moving through the brush, to the distant call of an owl. And then, from somewhere deeper in the hills, she heard it. A low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a breath. Something in between. Something that raised the hair on the back of her neck and sent a chill down her spine despite the warm evening air. She didn't wait to hear it again. She walked back to her truck, her pace quick but controlled, her hand resting on the service weapon at her hip. When she reached the parking lot, she turned and looked back at the dark hills one more time. Nothing, just shadows and stillness. Maria got in her truck and drove home. She never went back to that clearing again. The official record states that Rebecca Lynn Hartwell died as the result of a mountain lion attack on October 17, 1986. The case is closed. Douglas Wayne Pritchard is noted as a witness who was present at the scene, but not responsible for her death. The physical evidence has been catalogued and stored. The investigation is complete, but there are some who know the story differently. Vincent Torres still keeps his journal, still marks the red X's on his map when something unusual happens in the wilderness. Bill Kern still has his Polaroid of the unexplained footprint tucked away in a shoebox. Jennifer and David Payne still don't go camping, still have dreams about the shape that moved past their tent in the darkness, and Maria Castillo still thinks about that sound she heard in the hills, that low rumbling breath that came from something she couldn't see. She thinks about the fresh scratches on the tree, the marks that shouldn't have been there. She thinks about Douglas Pritchard's letter and the words on the radio, "Not alone." Maybe it was a mountain lion. Maybe it was a bear that shouldn't have been in that part of Texas. Maybe it was the convergence of fear and darkness and the human mind's desperate need to make sense of tragedy. Maybe it was nothing more than coincidence and misidentification and the way stories grow when people want to believe in something beyond the ordinary. Or maybe, in the wild places where the land stretches wide and the night comes down heavy, there are things that live in the margins, things that move through the shadows leaving only traces, a footprint, a scratch, a smell, a sound. Things that remind us the world is stranger and older than we pretend it is, and that some mysteries are meant to stay unsolved. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell was laid to rest beside her father in the Lawn Haven Memorial Gardens in San Angelo. Her headstone is simple, marked with her name, her dates, and a single line chosen by her mother, "Beloved daughter and teacher, forever in our hearts." On quiet evenings, when the wind blows across the cemetery and the sun sinks low over the Texas plains, visitors sometimes report a strange feeling near Rebecca's grave, a sense of presence, a whisper in the air that sounds like someone calling out for help, or maybe just the wind playing tricks. The groundskeepers dismiss it. Grief does strange things to people, they say, makes them see and hear things that aren't there. But every so often, when the moon is dark and the stars are bright, someone walking through those hills will find tracks that don't quite match anything they know, will hear a sound that raises ancient fears, will catch a smell that speaks of something wild and unknowable, moving through the night. And they'll remember the story of the schoolteacher who stopped at the wrong motel on the wrong night, and they'll wonder. They'll wonder if the wilderness is truly empty, or if it's full of things we've stopped looking for because the truth is harder to live with than the mystery. They'll wonder if Rebecca Lynn Hartwell was alone when she died, or if something walked beside her in those final moments, something that exists in the places we've forgotten, in the stories we tell to keep the darkness at bay. And they'll wonder, as Maria Castillo still wonders on sleepless nights when the wind howls outside her window, whether the scratches and the footprints and the sounds in the darkness are evidence of something real, or just the way the world reminds us that some questions will never have answers we can accept. The case is closed. Rebecca is home. Justice, in whatever form it could take after 38 years, has been served. But out in the hills where the mesquite grows thick and the limestone rises white against the sky, something still moves through the night. Something that leaves no name, no clear evidence, only the whisper of its passing and the stories that refuse to die. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some mysteries are meant to live in the space between knowing and unknowing, between the rational and the impossible. Maybe the truth isn't always something we find in a lab or a courtroom, but something we carry inside us, in the stories we tell, in the fears we honor, in the questions we're brave enough to ask, even when we know we'll never get an answer. Rebecca Lynn Hartwell was 28 years old when she disappeared. She was a teacher who loved books and quiet evenings, who dedicated her life to shaping young minds, who never hurt anyone. She deserved better than the fate she met on that October night in 1986, but she's not forgotten. Her story lives on, passed down through the years, a reminder that the world is wider and wilder than we want to believe. A reminder to pay attention to the signs, to trust our instincts, to never assume we're alone, because we never truly are. The wilderness watches, the wilderness remembers. And somewhere in the darkness, something is still out there, waiting for the next traveler who wanders too far from the light. This is the story of Rebecca Lynn Hartwell, a case solved after 38 years, a mystery that will never truly end. And perhaps that's the most honest answer we can give.